Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As we begin our fourth and final class of this series, Outsmarting Antisemitism. It's been a pleasure to journey with all of you. And today, being the fourth and final class, we're going to bring this down to the practical approach, practical application. As we know, we often encounter people who have powerful positions of influence, whether it's media, people in Washington, D.C., politicians, and unfortunately, oftentimes, they share views using their platform that could potentially harm us and harm our cause in the Middle East, and in general put Jews in an unfavorable light. Now, to be sure, I'm not talking about open anti-Semites. I'm not talking about the Farrakhands of our time. But we're talking about people of polite society that undermine our interests. Government officials who are soft when it comes to an anti-Semitic attack. We all heard about the terrible event that happened to a lone soldier, happened to be a Chabadnik, a former yeshiva student, former IDF, who was murdered right there near the Kotel just a day ago. Or a politician who demonizes Israel. And we all know what we're talking about. Unfortunately, it's all too often that we encounter such individuals. We have reckless so-called journalists who portray Israel and Jews in a negative light whenever they have the opportunity to do so. We have actors, actresses who boycott Israel or called for boycotts. We have university presidents who do not and will not, for whatever reason, let the Jewish students know that we will take care of this problem or that problem when it comes to anti-Semitism. So I'd like to direct your attention. Your page would be 114, exercise 4.1. And this question is a very blunt one. And it says here in the notes, do not ask the students to share this publicly. So maybe you could share it with your spouse. List famous living individuals who embrace opinions or have acted in ways that are harmful to Jews. And it gives us here 4 categories: journalism, entertainment, politics, academia. To list them, you could list them or you could think of them. I would venture to say that there's nobody in this room that cannot list at least one. Maybe you could put a couple of zeros after that one. In many instances, these people of influence are responsible directly or indirectly for the attitudes and even the policies that can have a serious impact on Jews, a serious impact on the policy towards Israel. It's shocking, but it's true. We all know it's true. And therefore, my friends, it's very important that we deal with such figures when it comes to outsmarting some anti-Semitism. Again, we're not talking about blatant and open anti-Semites. Let's give one example. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the president of France, let me back up a little. France was the primary supplier to Israel for weapons. And just before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Israel had ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets purchased and ordered from France. Okay, you order something, they got to deliver, right? You paid for it. Shockingly, the French government and the French president announced, first of all, he placed an embargo against the sale of military equipment, and he said this is for all sides. Here's the problem. it only adversely affected Israel. And the reason it only adversely affected Israel was because the Russians were supplying Egypt, they were supplying Syria with all the weapons that they needed, and this was done to boost the French relations with the Arab nations, because these relations were more lucrative for the French, rather than dealing with young Israel. I don't mean young Israel, the synagogue, I mean Israel that was quite young. You could say was still in its infancy, even though it accomplished a tremendous amount during those years. Now, as you think this is bad, it got even worse. This was in the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, in 1970 to be specific, the French government did sell these very jets to none other than Libya, who was a sworn enemy of Israel. So what do you do with this? So I'd like to direct your attention, page 116, text 1. I'd like to ask Dan if you would read for us Mirage jets to Libya.
After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict, Israel, the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply their own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan mirages is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type of plane as the 50 built for Israel but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now available to a hostile Arab country.
Thank you. Now let's put ourselves in that situation for a moment. Imagine after this takes place, the president of France is about to visit the United States. What should American Jews do in this situation? Should they go out and protest there, near the Capitol building? This is the question for tonight, and we're going to give an answer that may surprise you based on the various stories that we read about in the Torah of how Jews dealt with these types of situations. Although every time and situation is a little bit different, but there's a general rule of how it was dealt with. And as I said, it may surprise you. It did surprise me. But if you study about it and you delve into it, you'll see the logic and the importance, and most importantly, the bottom line success or the lack of success, the failure in the various approaches. Let's begin with the first story in the Torah that we cited in previous classes relating to such conflicts. We know the story, we just read about it in the Torah portion, where Jacob was facing a situation where his brother Esau, was out to kill him. They were twin brothers, but they had zero in common. In fact, they lived on two opposite extremes. Jacob was a man of the tent. He was a Torah scholar. He was a gentle soul. Esau was the opposite. And now, after 20 years, now they're coming face to face. And we know that Jacob prepared for three things, and we're going to read it inside in a moment. But listen to this. Jacob's preference, and again, let's wait until the end of the class to hear this, to really understand the full point. But here we begin. His preference was to win over his brother, at least temporarily, via gift giving warm words, and creating a favorable impression. He was indeed successful. This is a brother who wanted to kill him. And for Esav, murder was nothing. Esav, he dropped his plan, and instead of attacking his brother, he kissed him. This is what the Torah just told us in the weekly Torah portion. We just read it here at the synagogue. This model, my friends, has been employed by Jews of each era. We looked into the Torah for guidance. This is what Jews do. And this is the story that the Torah records of an anti-Semite who happened to have a twin brother who was a Jew. And the anti-Semite wanted to kill the Jew. He despised everything he stood for. If you look at text 2 on page 119, he had 3 steps. V'hiskin atzmai, Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response. Prayer, a gift, an armed struggle. But he preferred the gift. And he prepared for war only and if it was necessary. Last resort. We learn in the Torah about his lavish gift that he was able to afford because God had blessed him in a tremendous way. Goats, sheep, rams, camels, oxen, donkeys. He divided them and left space between each group of animals so that Esav would receive not just one, but many gifts. He tried his best. You know, sometimes gift giving could be a skill. You want to present it in a way that's going to really impress. That's what Jacob tried to do. He says, leave space between the group of animals. And then finally, when he came and approached, they all stood there, the wives, the children, and Jacob himself, and they bowed before Esav. Now, let me ask you, do you think Esav wanted to do this? You think he appreciated this? This is a person who wanted to kill him. This is a person who despised everything that he stood for. And it must have bothered him on some level. But when you know, and also he probably thought this is going to come across as weak. Why are you gifting your enemy? And I had the same question, and I struggled with this class. Because one side of us says, yeah, sometimes you got to fight when you're a Jew. As our childhood song used to tell us. Sometimes you got to fight when you're a Jew. But the fact of the matter is, it was 400 men. Jacob was very vulnerable at the time with his wife and little children. And most importantly, the reason he didn't feel weak by doing this is because he knew that he was not in Esav's hands. He was in God's hands. But as we learned, my friends, in the first class, this gesture was due to the fact that Hashem commanded us to create a space for his blessings, and therefore he didn't feel inferior to Esav. I'm doing what Hashem needs me to do to create the space so I could receive his blessings. You remember that class? God wants things to work in its natural order. And in order to do that, we got to do all within our means to have it appear as natural when really we know it's God doing it for us. What's natural about this? Sometimes, if you want to use the word, and I hate this word, appeasement, if it works, you got to do it. And this class is going to go a lot deeper than that and going to show that this is not fake behavior. We're talking about Jacob. We're talking about a Jew. I mean, you don't get more authentic than him. And this is what we're going to talk about in this class. Now, to be sure, is there a time and place where fighting is necessary, whether it's physical or whether it's with fighting words? Yes. But the Torah, and we're going to have other sources, tell us throughout history over and over again that should be last resort. Always. You should always try mit gutens, the good way, the easy way. Even if you know you're not changing the person. Even if the person still harbors hate. And sometimes, when we're successful with this approach, other things start happening even internally. But we're not even talking about that. And if you look at page 119, text 3, it says in the verse, Esav Esau ran towards Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept. They both wept. He kissed him. Instead of shooting bullets, He gave him a kiss. So this elaborate gift and this presentation aroused and awakened Esav's compassion. Now, did they become chummy brothers? I don't think so. Did Esav change? No. Was Jacob successful with this approach? You know, sometimes they say depends how you measure success. Hands down, he was wildly successful. He anticipated that some of his camp, which included his wives and children, will be killed. That's why he divided them. And he said if Esav attacks one, at least the other will be able to escape. Right? Now, in the Torah sometimes there are dots at a word. In the actual Torah, I don't know if you've ever seen it, and the dots indicate something, and there's a dots over the word Vayishakehu, and he kissed him. And of course the rabbis argue on what this means. Why are there dots? He didn't kiss him with a full heart. Others say, like Rab Shimon, that he did kiss him with his full heart, even though he harbored a lot of hate and resentment. At that moment, he was overcome with compassion. He was overcome with love. Sometimes you can have a feeling, a general feeling towards somebody, and then at the moment, you can have a change of heart. As we see, page 120, text 4, the Torah features dots over the words, and he kissed him. This is because Esav did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rab Shimon ben Yochai says, is an established fact that Esav hates Jacob. Esav and all his descendants. His descendants was considered the Roman Empire. It is an established fact. Esav hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time and he kissed him wholeheartedly. That's what Rab Shimon says. So what do we see here? And most importantly, what does this mean to you and I? Of how to approach. Let's not take a blatant anti-Semite. Let's take somebody in the media. Let's take somebody wherever of a position of influence that does not realize or does realize, but they're causing harm to our cause, to Israel's cause. We see that Yaakov worked hard to arouse Esav's compassion, and during these moments, he was effective in changing Esav, at least temporarily, to the extent that he was able to save himself and his entire camp, his entire family. Why is this? Because human emotions is complex. It's complicated. It's not simple. And haters themselves don't always understand the exact nature of their hatred, the exact nature of their feelings. And sometimes, listen, somebody commits a crime, you got to do the time and you got to punish. But sometimes we could see, and to take it to the other extreme, people who seem to be friendly towards the Jews, and then all of a sudden something happens in the world and they change like that. It also could happen the other way around, because emotions are complex. And therefore, what we're going to suggest in this class is, before we engage in verbal combat, posting on who knows where, we have to see who we're dealing with. And we have to deal slowly, carefully, and ask ourselves, is my actions or my words going to make the situation better or worse? Sometimes it's appropriate to call people out and shame them in public. They have no choice, sometimes. But we have to ask that question. We can't afford to shoot and then aim, because then it could turn these people against us and cause some serious, irreversible harm. And we see what the lesson is very clear. And this is the symbol for us, Jacob's children. Throughout history, Jews have assumed that the reason why this story is recorded in the Torah is to serve as a guide and to serve as a lesson throughout history of how to deal with anti-Semitism. Try as much as you can, mit gutens, right? Which means we make nice. Not to compromise who we are. And the reason is because, and we're going to see this more later, I don't want to jump the gun, it's more nuanced sometimes than we would imagine. Sometimes people grew up in a certain environment. And we're going to give an example of Mel Gibson and that episode that happened in 2006. I think it's a very good example, and I was hoping they bring it, and they do. I'd like to ask Lorraine on page 121, text 5, to read for us from Nachmanides, the great philosopher, physician. Take it away.
Diplomatic planning. The Midrash relates, Breshit Rabbah 78:15, that when Rabbi Mendy would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Mendy would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and adopt it in actual practice.
So we are supposed to wield influence over the Esavs of our generation whenever and however we possibly can. Which is basically saying that if Jews play their cards right, they could obtain various privileges that are vital for simple survival. Now, we also see that Jacob prepared to fight. He also prepared for war. You got to be practical. But he also tried to avoid war at all costs, which is why the gifts came first. Which means you and I, children of Jacob, children of Israel, whichever you prefer, same person, should avoid antagonizing non-Jews, but should find effective ways to try to influence them. And therefore, before we point fingers, or before we write somebody off, or before we slap a label on he or she, or whatever it may be, I'm not talking about the Farrakhands. I'm not talking about whatever. I'm talking about misguided people. Some people call them talking heads, whatever, in the media, whatever it may be. We could influence them, but it has to be dealt with. And this is not just empty words. We're going to cite numerous examples, not just from Torah, from Bible, but also from more contemporary times. Let's start. We went from the Torah, which is 3,300 years ago, but this event happened more than that with Jacob. Let's move a little bit closer to Rabbi Shimon, who lives in Israel during the 2nd century, at the time when Israel was occupied by none other than Rome. Who were the Romans? The children of Esav. Now, just to show you that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was not exactly a fan of the Romans, we know that he was caught, or somebody told on tattletale, that he spoke disparagingly about the Romans, about their policies, how are they motivated by self-interest. So whatever they build, whether it's bridges or whatever, parks, it's all for themselves. And because a fellow Jew ratted him out, he needed to escape with his son Elazar, and for 13 years, first 12 and then another year, he spent in a cave. When the Roman rulers of Judea passed a law banning certain Jewish practices, Rabbi Shimon himself traveled to Rome. By the way, this is a long journey in those days, to win a concession for annulling some of the decrees relating to restrictions on Judaism. And was he successful? He was successful. So he wasn't a fan, and yet he said, I'm going to try this approach first. And he traveled, and he was successful. And this is a lesson for us as well. As we see on page 122, text 6 from the Talmud. Mike, you have the thing? Okay, so we'll have you read.
The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles.
So this is the same Rabbi Shimon who says it's an established fact that Esav hates Jacob. He wasn't detached from reality. He's the one who said whatever the Romans do is for their own glory. selfish. Wasn't exactly a fan, and he paid the price. He was exiled for 13 years until the Roman emperor died. There's a heavenly voice that came to tell him it's safe to leave the cave now. And yet, he was the one who traveled to Rome to offer up kind words. Words of appeasement. I'm going to use that word. And he was successful. Why? Because this was the experience that he saw in the Torah as regards to Yaakov. And it taught him that these two were no contradiction. I can believe that you don't like me and still believe that you will give me what I need. You got to be flexible. We're in a difficult situation. You could not like me, but you could still give me what I need. And this has been the case throughout history. In fact, throughout the generations, there were people called court Jews, shtadlanim, right? Advocates that would travel. If you look at page 123, figure 4.1, you will see in the various places who the shtadlanim, who the advocates were. One of the most famous ones, Yosef of Rashim, who advocated on behalf of German Jewry. Who was he advocating towards the king at the time, Charles, who was a grandson of Isabella, not exactly a Jew lover, who was responsible for the Spanish Inquisition. In fact, when the grandson Charles was king, he oversaw it. We know what happened in 1492. 1492 was always referred to as the most difficult and the best and the worst of times. Because America was discovered, 1492, and we know what this discovery led to, especially for Jews, eventually, as it developed and became the United States. Obviously, it wasn't just the United States, but talking about our great country, but it was also the year of the Spanish Inquisition and the terrible, terrible atrocities and horrible persecution that took place. And yet, even though this was not a friend of the Jews, Isabella, King Ferdinand, nevertheless, this advocate, Yosef, visited their courts many, many times and managed to be received warmly and receive privileges. You got to do what works, right? You got to do what works. Why? Because of a novel idea that we read before. Not to write off and label something as bad and irredeemable. Even though you don't like me, you could still do what I need you to do for me. It's all about relationships. We call it diplomacy. Diplomacy, more times than not, works. Works. Now, somebody could raise their hand and say, Rabbi, do you think diplomacy works in the Middle East? Has it worked? Not really. Not really. In some cases, in more recent years, have we seen some progress? Yes, we have. But here's the point. Here's the point. It always has to be our first effort. Always. Because if we go to war, and I don't just mean physical war, a war of words, if we slap a label and say, anti-Semite, get out of here, nothing good is going to come of that, that's for sure. And where do we learn this from? Jacob, Yaakov Avinu. This is a pretty good source. It's a pretty good biblical source. We learned it from the times of the Romans and the great leaders and throughout the generations. In fact, there were certain great rabbis and leaders when, as they were traveling to see the powers of their time, governors, kings, queens, they would recite the passages from that Torah portion describing Jacob's showdown with his brother Esav to remind themselves, why am I doing this? What am I, weak? No, I'm not weak, because I know I'm not in Esav's hands, I'm in God's hands, and maybe God, just maybe, wants me to take this approach because I need to create that space so his blessings could come my way. Page 124, text 7, we talk about a court Jew, and this is the very Yosef who, from his memoirs, who we spoke about a moment ago, Helen, would you like to read for us text 7?
In 51, the denouncers once again hounded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Shivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path.
So, Helen, what was Yosef's objective? I was reading this, and I was kind of arguing with myself, but then I realized that his goal was simply to ensure that the German Jewish community would survive. When we're talking about survival, we don't play games. We don't try to be tough guy. We stood no chance. It was literally, in those days, like a single sheep surrounded by 70 hungry wolves. You know what God says in that situation? No, I'm not going to create a miracle for you. I don't create miracles in vain. I don't waste miracles. Wait a second, God, you split the sea. At that time, it was necessary for me to split a sea. I want you to make your hishtadlus. Put your best foot forward. Use your Jewish cup. Be diplomatic. Don't write off people. View them as misguided haters. Just because they don't like you, it doesn't mean you can't get something good out of them. Now, I'm going to reiterate this again. Do you make these calculations with Nazis? No, you kill Nazis. Do you make these calculations with terrorists who just killed a Chabad lone soldier? No, you kill them first. I think I'm stating the obvious, right? But I just want to make that disclosure right out front. And what I just said is not an emotional thing, even though I'm pretty emotional today about what happened. It's the law. The Torah says if somebody comes to kill you, you have to hashkim laharga. You have to kill him first. It's your obligation, especially if you're the head of the household. In fact, if somebody breaks into your house, according to Jewish law, you have to kill them. You know why? Because you could assume that they're there to kill you. You could assume that they're to kill you because they know that nobody in their right mind is going to stand by and watch the thieves empty your house. And therefore you're going to stand up to it, and they're prepared for that showdown, and you have to beat them to it. So I think I made that point loud and clear, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about people in position of power, people in position of influence. This is not thugs in the street either. And people who you could reason with, not Nazis, people you could reason with. And even though you know how they feel about Jews, nevertheless, you should still try. Jacob was dealing with a very extreme Jew hater. Happened to be his brother, but a very extreme Jewish hater, and he was successful. He was successful in receiving God's blessings, if you will. I get in trouble for this. Not in a miraculous way. He brought such lavish gifts. He smothered him with love. You see what I'm saying? This is biblically sourced, not compromise, because you're not selling your soul, you're not selling your religion, but diplomacy. And as I mentioned before, Charles was a grandson of Isabella. We all know the history. We all know what took place. And nevertheless, this rabbi is visiting him and is successful. We're talking about the Spanish Inquisition, one of the darkest periods in Jewish history, 1492 and beyond. And of course, needless to say, did this approach always work? No, of course not. Now, because of time constraint, it's a very long, it's quite long. We're going to skip the next one, and we're going to go to something a little bit deeper. And this I really, really appreciated as I was struggling with some of the ideas in this class. The science of hate. Let's be honest for a second. How could anyone expect to gain favoritism or something from some real anti-Semite who has shown his true colors? It sounds weak, and it sounds unrealistic. An explanation appears to have been provided, get this, by modern neuroscientific research in a book called Incognito, which is The Secret Lives of the Brain. The Secret Lives of the Brain. Our brains and the anti-Semites' brains are very, very nuanced and very complex, multifaceted. David Eagleman analyzes the case of actor Mel Gibson that I mentioned and referenced before. Before I tell you what he said, and we all remember that incident, it got major media coverage. It happened in 2006. It's hard to believe how long ago that was. After he said what he said, and I'm going to tell you in a moment, to remind you in a moment what he said the following. He said, "There is no excuse, nor should there be any tolerance for anyone who thinks or expresses any kind of anti-Semitic remark. I am not an anti-Semite." Here's the story. July 28th, 2006, this very well-known, one of the biggest Hollywood celebrities, Mel Gibson, was pulled over for speeding in Malibu. You may have heard of that shtetl. It's a shtetl in Europe. And the cop who pulled him over, James Me is a Jewish name. He was Jewish. Better face. And he was drunk out of his mind. He did not pass the test. And in his rant, he discovered that the cop who pulled him over is a Jew. And all of a sudden, the rant began. I think they caught it on camera too, part of it. Jews are responsible for all wars in the world. And some other colorful language that we will keep out of this class in the Rebbe's shul. And Mel Gibson, after apologizing, he says, "I ask that people realize that I'm not a bigot." How am I supposed to realize you're not a bigot after what you just said? So I looked a little bit further here, and Gibson had a very close, and still has, I think, a Jewish friend, Dean Delvin, and he said that Gibson's remarks that night was as a result of alcohol abuse. His remarks said nothing about the man himself. Now, this is a controversial statement. Many of us have a hard time with it. I remember I had a hard time with it then. Sometimes these very people who lash out in this way, this despicable way, turn around and do something phenomenal for the Jewish community. And they do it over many, many years. And the skeptic, and maybe the cynic, will say, no. You showed your true colors. You will forever be an anti-Semite. What's the real answer? And that's why this extraordinary course, I think it's an extraordinary course, is going to go into the neuroscience of this idea, into the brain, and going to point out through various texts that the human brain is something that's very complex, and sometimes these very people don't clearly know themselves where these drives and forces of hatred comes from. Did you ever experience a change of heart towards somebody or something, and you can't quite explain how that happened? It could happen to an anti-Semite too. Sometimes people could be raised in a certain environment, brought up with certain notions, and they stop believing the rhetoric. And then they start thinking for themselves, and they encounter a Jew who sanctified God's name, not a made-of, but somebody who actually is a mensch, charitable, honest, hardworking, law-abiding, and they say, wow, I was wrong. And by the way, many, many haters have turned around. They were enlightened. We talked about it in the last class. Let's see what David Eagleman says about the cognitive diversity. Albert, would you like to read for us page 128, text 8a?
Cognitive diversity. Brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There's an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at the party offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is, whether you put your hand up or out. As the French essayist Michel de Montaigne put it, there is as much difference between us as ourselves as there is between us and others.
I love it. There's much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. And you have to give people a chance. If you shout and holler at all and anyone who ever said anything about Jews, good luck. Good luck. And of course, we're not talking about a situation where somebody's harming Jews physically, right? So accordingly, neuroscience would describe Gibson's anti-Semitic incident in the following way, text 8b. Albert, you did such a fine job, and it's two parts, 8a and 8b. Take it away.
Team of rivals, returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle among internal systems. To be clear, I'm not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I am saying that a team of rival brains can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle toward the short-term, unreflective faction, which has no more or less claim than any other faction to be the true one.
So let's just develop this. It's pretty deep stuff. My brain sees chocolate cake. By I'm diabetic, right? Okay, forget it. Clear your hard drive. Right? I have a diabetic kid. There you go. We're not picking on anybody. And everybody's partaking. We know Jews, there's no conversation that's better than over food, over a nice piece of cake and coffee. I remember one of the Seinfeld episodes, George's mother and father, it's the only time I saw them agree on something, that they went to the Machatanim's house and they did not serve them cake with the tea. What kind of shanda is that? We're sitting there like fools and there's no cake, right? Okay, a nice Jewish couple. See, we're giving sources from all over the place. So I want the cake. I want to enjoy the company. And I also like how it tastes. And I want you to leave me alone and let me do what I need to do. But I know what it's going to cause. I know that it's unhealthy because I'm overweight, I'm diabetic. I know this is not good, and it's after 8 p.m. Right? It's 10:30 at night. Chabad. The rabbi's eating the cake. That's one side. And sometimes that force is pretty powerful. So how is it that the same person on the other side of the brain, or maybe the same side, turns around and says, no, I'm not going to do it? How about the anti-Semite? Once something clicks, something angers, there's some alcohol in the bloodstream. I grew up in an anti-Semitic environment where people assumed that Jews are this, that, and the other, believed all of the lies. Maybe Gibson grew up in this environment. We control the media. We control Hollywood, Hollyweird. We control the banks. Israel, this and Israel, day in and day out. And now I have alcohol and the cop who's pulling me over and annoying me is a Jew. And all of a sudden, that part of my chocolate brain, to use the analogy, just has an outburst. And I come around the next day, right? And now I'm not under the I call the not the influence of alcohol, the affluence of alcohol. And all of a sudden, I'm apologizing, and I'm telling you, I'm not a bigot. And people say, stop it. You know, nichnas yayin yatsa said. You drink wine, and your real secrets come out. This class is trying to suggest, do not write people off. In situations where you have to take care of business, in situations where the Jewish community is at danger, that's a different story. There's the Farrakhan's and the Hitlers of the world, different story. Arab nations, the bloody murder that took place yesterday, different story. But we're not talking about this. We could argue from today to tomorrow, should we give Gibson another chance or not? So I'm going to go out on a limb and put myself in danger in front of a room of Jews and say the following. If he says he's sorry, and he backs it up with actions for years and years and years, not only do I accept his apology, but I welcome him in. Not only because I cannot afford to manufacture another enemy, but because I know, after studying this class and some other readings that I've done in preparation for this class, that the brain is a complex place. And I know in my own brain how sometimes I'm all over the board on an issue. I could be here and I could be there. I could be with the chocolate, I could be absolutely not. I could be with this team blue and team red. If somebody is fed poison day in and day out, or grew up in a certain culture, in a certain environment, and then the person is under the affluence of alcohol and has an outburst, to me, that does not say that he is irredeemable. It's disgusting. He should be held accountable. Words matter. It emboldens the enemy. I'm sure all of the enemies rear their ugly head, and we're very happy to hear that. And he has to apologize, and he has to make amends, and he has to do what he has to do. But after all, no, you never accepted. And there are Jews who live that way. This is not our way. Not because little me. Forget about me. This is not our way. This wasn't Jacob's way. This wasn't our Rebbe's way. This is not how Chabad became Chabad. And we're going to see soon, dealing also with very difficult people. Not haters, but close to it. And how the Rebbe approached them. This is not weakness. This is not no spine. This is sensible diplomacy when necessary. And by the way, today we're living in a completely different time. In those days, they didn't have options like we have today. In those days, you either prayed that they're going to accept your gift, or you're at their mercy. We didn't have a voice, literally. So modern neuroscience suggests that the brain contains multiple voices and opinions on any given matter. This is pretty well sourced, this stuff. And during any particular moment, there is the question of which voice is stronger now. Which voice am I going to listen to now? This explains that someone can go on an anti-Semitic rant while also being friendly with Jews. In fact, he has a Jew that's very, very close with him. It also explains why even an anti-Semite can be good for Jews. Good for Jews. And sometimes we have to be pragmatic and say, he's still not going to like me, but if he does what I need him to do, I'll take what I could get. And you know, oftentimes they do come around. But what's the alternative? To be in a group that is purists and black and white and just dismiss and dismiss. We can't afford to. Who are our friends? Some in the Christian community. Who are our friends? In terms of nations, we know what happens in the despicable UN. Now, how is today so different? We have platforms, which unfortunately is censored, but it's a whole nother story. And I could rant and rave on Facebook and Twitter every time I see somebody who says anything disparagingly or what I perceive to be disparagingly about Jews. And we have influence in high places and even within the Chabad community. There are rabbis who are very well connected. Could you imagine those rabbis with positions of responsibility, every time somebody says something about Jews that they don't like, gets up and starts berating them in public? I've been to Washington to demonstrate, right? I'm not going to say when it was, but we've bussed in a couple of times from New York. It's not like there's never a time for it. There has to be responsible leadership. But let's see what happens here. Text 9, 131. Sandy, would you like to read for us?
President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police.
Okay, now let's see what the Rebbe said about it at that time. Mike, we're going to go on the other side if we can. Thank you, Mike. We go to Denise, would you like to on page 132, 10A.
The public protest against the President of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent, or at least reduce, French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that the agreements of this nature have been reached in the past.
This is what the Rebbe said. This is what the Rebbe said. And by the way, there's been other times when it came to Russia, this is during the time of communism, where other Jewish organizations went out in the streets and protested about this, that, and the other, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe was against the protest. He said, you're endangering the lives of the Jews who are stuck behind the Iron Curtain more by waging these protests. Instead, you should work with backdoor diplomacy and go through the conventional channels. Now, obviously, it's all in the details, and you have to judge each case individually, but the Rebbe was against it. Now, the Rebbe did not clarify here, in what Denise just read, what he meant about past agreements. But in the talk a year later, he did say what it was. I'll ask Naftali, 10b.
When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. The effort backfired. It cannot be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with the Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion must be drawn from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them. You are an anti-Semite, you are a thief, you are a murderer. Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings.
So we see that the age-old approach of working behind the scenes to minimize harm and gain benefit has continued to be effective even till today. This was the Rebbe approach. Now, I mentioned before, and I've told the story many times, about Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina. He was elected to the United States in 1972, United States Senate, in 1972. He voted consistently against Israel, about cutting ties with Israel, about minimizing the support, monetary support, which is literally life and death. You could only imagine how angry some American Jews were, people who are engaged in the process and are involved. Now, would you say he's an anti-Semite? Yeah. You would say he's an anti-Semite. Or definitely not helpful to the cause. Listen to this. It's a shocking story. 1984 comes around, and Chabad has a gala in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the fact that President Reagan and both houses of Congress designated the Lubavitcher Rebbe's 82nd birthday as Education Day. Education Day, USA, on the Rebbe's birthday. This is to promote the Rebbe's teachings, education, to stress the point that education is not just math, science, and so forth, but it's also to teach about the one God, morality, ethics, and so forth. Guests, amongst the many, many guests that were there, none other than Jesse Helms was there. Showed up at a Chabad function. So, Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, you may have heard about him. He wrote a long letter, and by his own admission, it was a letter of chutzpah. He was a young lawyer at the time. How could Chabad honor a person like that? Very fair question. Very fair challenge. Here's what the Rebbe said. He said, number one, Jesse Helms was not honored. On the contrary, Senator Helms came to honor and pay tribute to Chabad's commitment to education. That's number one. He came to show honor. He came to pay tribute. He came to support. He wasn't being honored. That's number one. And then, in a postscript, the Rebbe wrote the following. Page 136, text 11. George? Or Roberta? Oh, yeah, okay.
Subject to change. I trust you will agree that in regard to the persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a livelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, though I have never personally met the said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war. nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There is surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes.
Thank you. So, as it happens, Professor Dershowitz added a postscript of his own. And you know what it was? It said the following, quote, "Sure enough, very shortly after he was honored," okay, you could argue whether he was honored. The Rebbe said he came to honor, but we'll leave that aside. Senator Helms assumed a very influential role in the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee and became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and of other Jewish causes as well. So obviously, this is all Dershowitz, the Rebbe had had an enormous influence on persuading Jesse Helms. This is what he wrote, in part. We could get things done that are very important from people who seem to be against us. And by his own admission, he says that Rebbe was right. I didn't agree with him at the time. I was very angry about it, but he managed to turn him around. Why and how? And this is why in this class we went into a subject that I don't think anybody expected. Brain, and how the brain works, which we still don't understand how it works, and how we could pick and choose based on circumstances and how we're feeling, if we're tired or not, if we're with this group of people or that group of people. And by the way, people who say nice things about Jews could also turn on a dime. But this senator was very influential, and we have to get the important things even if it comes from somebody who doesn't particularly care for us. And if we play our cards right, we can even inspire them to see things differently. But all of this is possible only and if we don't slap a label on them. Now let's take this story and say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe would condemn him in public, label him as an anti-Semite, and dismiss him completely. Who would get hurt? Hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews would get hurt. Because he had not just a position, he had a very high-ranking, influential position that directly affected our policy in the Holy Land. Now the Rebbe, being the tzaddik that he is, saw that before it happened. He knew where the senator is going to go. You and I have a hard time with the Rebbe inviting him to a Chabad function. It was very controversial. I'll be honest with you. I heard the story from Alan Dershowitz live at the Chabad convention in New York, where there were 5,000-6,000 Chabad rabbis from all over the world and their supporters. And he said, wow, what am I doing in front of a Chabad crowd? And many of the rabbis say to themselves, what is he doing? In fact, early on in his career, he took certain positions that are directly opposed some of the things we were trying to do. I believe, including the Hanukkah's coming up, menorah in public places. And I'm saying this on camera, but there was even an internal dispute between the rabbi who knew him and brought him and convinced the board to have him speak, and other rabbis. And I saw that exchange. It was pretty heated. And the rabbi says, I'm sure everybody in your shul is just perfect. I'm sure you checked them out, right? Please. Do you know that he comes to He comes to Harvard Friday night for Shabbat dinner, and because of that, 600 students show up. And he cited different other things. But look at him today. You know, we had a Chabadnik who was terribly abused, and he was given a sentence that was far, far worse than what he did, and was going to pay with 26 years in prison. And many senators and many lawyers signed a petition and said this is blatant anti-Semitic. This is a modern day blood libel. And who was at the top of shouting from the rooftops on his defense? Not only was it Dershowitz, but they wrote a special Torah for him in Crown Heights in 770 because of what he did. How did we manage to turn him around? The same way we managed to turn Jesse Helms around, because when we are able to bring out the positivity in others, when we're able to be more positive and not quickly dismiss people, which is not always easy. I understand. I'm a human being, you know, I eat and breathe, as they say. But we're able to bring more positivity, not naivete, not stab me in the back because I ignored that you have a knife. But see beyond the exterior layers, miracles could happen. But it can only happen if we act responsibly. If we don't point and shout at anybody who criticizes Israel's policy as anti-Semitic. But look at who we're talking about. Deal accordingly. And the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. I'm not sure why in the pudding and not in the sushi, but it's in the pudding. And that was the Rebbe's approach. Why? Because the Rebbe was a Torah man. And the Rebbe got his sources from the Bible, and from the Tanakh, and from the Talmud. This is how Jews behaved all the way. And today we have more influence. We could fight. We could condemn. You got to be responsible. Stop hurting our kids. Stop hurting our community. Stop hurting funding for the Iron Dome. What do you mean? I'm hurting? I'm telling them how bad they are. Chacham. You're telling them how bad they are. These are people of influence you're talking about. You expect them to come and see what we see by behaving this way? We talked about on Shabbos, World War II and how that all turned around because of a Jew who was close with the president when he was a youngster, who was an honest man. And the president knew it. So when he came to ask the president to intervene, he couldn't turn him down. This has always been true. I'm sure he had issues with Jews, okay? The fact of the matter is, and with this we're going to conclude, we're still in exile. The definition of exile is that the truth is hidden. That revelation of godliness isn't the way it should be. We're living in a world where it's conceivable to deny that there's a God, or to swear to God that there is no God. That's a religious atheist, right? How do we operate within this imperfect environment of exile, at least until Mashiach comes? We learn from Jacob. We manage the situation and gain goodwill and favor from our foes, even if their hearts are not entirely into it. And this is the practical lesson. We should be slower, listen to this, to name and shame, and quicker to engage and influence. Slower to name and shame, quicker to engage and influence. Are there exceptions to what I'm saying? Of course, it goes without saying. Somebody's killing Jews, you don't name and shame, you kill him first. We're not talking about this. Jesse Helms, I asked before, is he an anti-Semite? Well, as it turns out, not so fast. Maybe he had anti-Semitic views. Maybe he was turned around because how the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the leader of world Jewry in our generation, treated him. Maybe that warmed him up. Maybe that enlightened him. Maybe, just maybe, it had him see things from a perspective that he never occurred to him. Because he grew up in a certain environment. We are all subjects. We are products of our upbringing, of our environments. Could you imagine? Did I tell you the story of when I flew with the Milwaukee Brewers? I told you, right? So I'm sitting there. It was us, 18-year-old nudniks from Brooklyn, who used to shout and holler at the Brewer games, always rooting for the other team. And now we're flying back from Milwaukee to New York. It's us, 10 counselors, and the Milwaukee Brewers. Why? By divine providence. I don't know, their plane broke down. And we were sports guys, and we sat next to the lavatory, and every time the players came to the back, like Paul Molitor, and we had Jesse Orozco, who won the World Series in 1986 for the Mets. Poor Mets. We're still talking about 69 and 86. But in any case, you can sit shiva for that. And we were talking, and they were very impressed how much we knew. They said, shiva students, you should know so much sports. We know. And then a former player who was the manager, Phil Gardner, came. Time for him to go to the bathroom. So we let him go, and then when he came out, we spoke to him. And he really, really enjoyed it. He really enjoyed our conversation. We talked about Torah, we talked about sports, we talked about politics. He says, I want to tell you something. My father was an anti-Semite. I'm not using that word lightly. And I always asked him, what do you have against Jews? Do you know any Jews personally? He said, no. But I see the influence. I see what they do. He was full of conspiracy theories. And I always challenged him, and he would get annoyed at me. When I saw you at the back of the plane, I said, you know what? Now is my chance to redeem myself. Because I never believed how my father believed. And when I saw you nice rabbis, I decided to see for myself, you're wonderful. You're great. What he said. I wonder if there's footage somewhere of this. And he told us where to get the tickets. We were very happy to go. And we sat just above the dugout. And during the game, he came out and he was chatting, and hundreds of people were wondering, probably wondering, oh, those Jewish men, oh, they're trying to buy the team, or they're dealing and wheeling and something like this. And then he said, if we win tonight, you can come back tomorrow. We said, we actually learn for a living, but thank you very much. They didn't win. The Yankees killed them, but that's, of course, to be expected. The point is, they taught us a great lesson. He never accepted it. Now, could you imagine if the first thing out of his mouth was, my father was a raving anti-Semite, and we were these hot-headed, immature, not very wise, young 18-year-olds, and start condemning him? Yeah, that would have worked out very well. Instead, he told us it at the end. Or actually, he said it at the beginning, but we still engaged him, or somewhere in the middle of the conversation. Look at that. He's forever going to be different than his father. He was never influenced by his father's views because he saw that his father is a bigot and is a hater. And he didn't want to be that. Life is too short. It's too heavy to hate. I rather love, and love is contagious. And therefore, my friends, we conclude, so long as we are in exile, we have to try mit gutens, the good way, the straight way. And, as I said before, just because somebody or a society is nice to us one day, they could also turn on us. That's happened as well. We rely on one thing, and that's God. And if God commands us to create a space, to do all that we need to do with diplomacy, using our Yiddish cup, backroom channels, to get where we need to go, for the safety and security of our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, and indeed around the world, we have to do that. Because only then and only then will the blessings from Hashem be revealed to us. Soon, we will reach a time when Esav will no longer be marching towards us with 400 men looking to harm us. In that era, the era of Mashiach, Esav will kiss the Jewish people genuinely. It will be an enduring kiss, but we're not there yet. And finally, page 139, figure 4.3. This is the takeaways, the course takeaways. Flory, would you like to read for us?
Course takeaways. We will remain calm. We will trust in God and upgrade our connection with Him. We will create natural means through which God can provide our security. We will not internalize anti-Semitism by altering our Jewish heritage. We will be open about our Jewish identity, benefiting Jews and fostering diversity. We will share awareness of God's mission for all humanity and thereby help individuals avoid experiencing an inner void. We will thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land and seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. We will avoid labels and public shaming. Instead, we will work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people.
Thank you very, very much.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARC, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is, you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
So I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton.
Thank you very much.
He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
שדור der חוק המדינה מדав gehen im Arbei Sefer. In der Bei Sefer miusod und durchgenommen. Avos darf gern Arbei Sefer darf gern Jidit. Nicht darf Eisfurmen, Ufton, Ufmachen. Dem Jeser Leib Hoodom, als soll sein mit Midis Tevis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in der Besser Sefer. Aber der Rieker lernen seine Ries, was zum Ton Teva Lumsig. Und das ist der Teva Amiti für sich. Und das ist im Ganzen nicht rein in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Besefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novik, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Lady Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month.
I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us in this course with the half the lights on, with my mic on. And what we ended with over there is really the point of all of it. To go out there and reach out to somebody that perhaps you disagree with, you don't see eye to eye with. Because if there's goodwill, positivity, always trying to bring out the best in others, the results will most likely be positive. If it's the opposite, the results will most probably be negative. And therefore, to reach out with love, to reach out with acceptance, with tolerance, and not to be quick to condemn.